Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, AlbyMTG. For today's video, we have our first video of 2019, where we'll be taking a look at a little over 20, maybe 25-ish cards that just got spoiled today for Ravnica Allegiance. Ravnica Allegiance comes out on the 25th of January, pre-release is the 19th, so it is nice that we're getting all of these previews ahead of time, and we can start kind of thinking about what we might be wanting to look at for those limited pre-release events, kind of what guild we might want to play the most, as well as getting our first look at what we might be seeing in Standard as well, because there were some cards today that have some Standard implications to go along with them, so can't wait to talk about those. Really quickly, before we do begin, the last card that they spoiled before I didn't get to make a video on it or anything like that, because they only spoiled one card that day. They spoiled Absorb already, which is just a reprint from a previous set. 1 white mana, 2 blue mana, counter target spell, you gain 3 life. So it has Healing Salve mixed with counter spell put together into one card. Not sure that it's going to have a ton of implications in Standard. I think like its biggest competition is easily Sinister Sabotage for the Azorius or Jeskai control decks, and I think you might end up seeing people just playing the Sinister Sabotage instead, just because of that Surveil one. It's pretty nice to be able to kind of set up your draws, remove the dead cards from the top of your library, that sort of thing. So that's kind of its biggest competition right now in Standard. You could see people start playing Absorb, and that would get rid of the need to play something like Revitalize against the sort of more aggressive strategies. So yeah, like I said, its biggest thing is Sinister Sabotage for those strategies where you could play both. Obviously, if you're like Dimir control, you're not going to be playing Absorb. There's no reason to splash for Absorb when you could already just play Sinister Sabotage, but for the Azorius control builds and the Jeskai control builds, it will be kind of interesting to see if Absorb ends up seeing any play. So now we can get on to the cards that just got spoiled today. So of course we have the cycle of Guild Gates. If you can remember from Guilds of Ravnica, for the Guild Gates, they spoiled one artwork, or they spoiled 2 artworks for each Guild Gate. So there's a total of 10 Guild Gates. Here you can see the Simic and the Gruul ones. My favorite Gruul Guild Gate would be this one right here that has the door and then the broken down archway here in the back. And then for Simic, I really like both of these. I think both of those look really cool for Simic. As we move on to Orzhov, my favorite, or Orzhov and Rakdos, my favorite Orzhov one is probably just this one right here, the one with the big Orzhov symbol here in the center. And then for Rakdos, you have the giant Rakdos symbol, as well as this sort of like leading into a dungeon sort of one. I kind of like this one a little bit more. It's just sort of, I don't know, this one's a little bit too showy for me. I kind of like this one where it just kind of has like a normal entryway here, and then as you get down closer and closer into the door, you realize you're entering where the Rakdos roam. And you can also see for each of the Guild Gates, there's flavor text from cards. Domri Raid we know is going to be one of the Planeswalkers for Ravnica Allegiances. Rorikthar we haven't quite seen yet. Vannifar we haven't seen yet. Zagana already got spoiled as well. Judith just got spoiled today, so we'll get to talk about her in just a few seconds. The Rakdos here as well, his guild, we haven't seen Rakdos spoiled quite yet. Teysa we haven't seen spoiled yet, and then Kaya just got spoiled today as well, so we'll get to talk about her. For Dovanbon and Lavinia, these are the Azorius ones. For the Azorius Guild Gate, I think I like this one more than this one. But Lavinia has already been spoiled. We talked about her and her potential legacy implications and possibly vintage implications as well in a previous video. And then Dovanbon just got spoiled today as well with his Planeswalker cards. So those are some legendary creatures that you might want to keep an eye on, look out for in upcoming spoilers. The Locket Cycle is something that we saw from Guilds of Ravnica as well, and so you can see that they're bringing those back to complete the cycle of Lockets. The Simic Locket here, the Gruul Locket over here, and then as we come up here, we have the Rakdos Locket, Azorius Locket, and the Orzhov Locket. My personal favorite in terms of the artwork is probably just the Azorius Locket. I think it looks a lot like Spellbreaker from Skyrim. Let me see if I can bring that up. Spellbreaker, Skyrim. Let me see if you guys... Yeah, look at the image right here. Let me go to images, I guess. So like this thing right here, I think looks exactly like the Azorius Locket. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not seeing it correctly, but this was the first thing that I thought of when I saw the Azorius Locket. I had also just been playing Skyrim earlier today, so it's possible that Spellbreaker was just on my mind, but I think it looks pretty similar. So after the Locket Cycle, we have Breeding Pool, which is the Shockland Cycle, so Breeding Pool's there, and then we have Goblet Shrine, Hallowed Fountain, Blood Crypt, and Stomping Ground, which means we have the full cycle of Shocklands now in Standard, one for each color combination, so your mana is going to be great in Standard now, along with the checklands from Dominaria as well as Ixalan as well to go together with these shock lands to create a really good mana base. You're going to see a lot more 3-color and possibly even 4-color decks now that the mana is just really, really good in Standard, which I think could potentially lead to a fantastic, fantastic Standard metagame where a lot of different decks are playable. So we'll start off here with a foreign card here. We've got a 2-mana 2/2 Speaker's Pet here. This is a green and a blue for a creature mutant. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost up to 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana used for the ability cost to activate to less than 1 mana. They have a mana ability cost to activate to less than 1 mana. So basically you can't go less than 1 mana for your activation cost, but this can be really good. Basically what you're looking to break Speaker's Pet with, or I guess we'll talk about the tap ability too. You can tap it, and then the next time a creature you control activates Adapt this turn, it uses Adapt as if it has no +1/+1 counter. So this card could be really crazy for the Adapt deck, because if we can remember correctly, the Adapt mechanic, you can't actually activate the Adapt mechanic if there is currently some number of +1/+1 counters on the creature already. So we'll take a look at, or I guess we can just go back quick. We'll take a look at Zagana, since Zagana was already spoiled with the Adapt mechanic. We'll just scroll down here a bit. Here you can see Zagana, and we'll scroll to where we can read the Adapt mechanic. Yeah, so if this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, you put 4 +1/+1 counters on it with the Adapt 4. Same thing with the Aeromunculus, 4 mana for Adapt 1. If it has no +1/+1 counters on it, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And so when we see the card that we just took a look at there, the Mutant, we'll scroll back up, there he is. The Speaker's Pet, the creature type mutant here. When we take a look at this card, you can tap it, and then even if that creature has some number of +1/+1 counters on it now, you can still activate its Adapt mechanic. So for Zagana, you could activate after putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it, turning it into, I believe, an 8/8. You can then potentially use the Speaker's Pet, tap it, and then use Zagana's adaptability again, turn Zagana into a 12/12, and you can do the Adapt mechanic as well during combat. You can do it at instant speed, so you're able to, maybe mess with the combat math a little bit using the Adapt mechanic now, which I think is pretty cool, using the Speaker's Pet here. And then the activated abilities, costing 2 less is going to be, it's meant for Adapt, but really we're going to end up seeing a lot of for Eternal applications, maybe even Commander applications. You'll be looking for cards that have a some sort of activation that costs generally 3 or more, because you'll be able to take that 3, subtract it to 2 down to 1 mana, so it'll only be 1 mana to do that. Maybe if you have something that could tap to activate or to create mana, like maybe something that would be 3 colorless and tap it to produce maybe 4 mana, something like that. You can reduce that by 2 and then turn it into a good mana generator, mana accelerator with the Speaker's Pet, which I think is pretty interesting. There is a lot of potential behind this card to just break with something that could be printed in the future. The fact that it can't reduce the mana ability to less than 1 is it kind of reduces its chances of breaking things, but I think Speaker's Pet has a little bit of potential once people get the time to go through the history of Magic and figure out what cards are really broken along with the Speaker's Pet. So after Speaker's Pet, that takes us to the Sphinx of Foresight, which is 4 mana for a 4/4 flyer. At the beginning of your upkeep, you scry 1. But then it also has the ability which says you may reveal this card from your opening hand. If you do, you scry 3 at the beginning of your first upkeep, which is pretty cool. It has some pregame effects to it, which I think is really interesting for the Sphinx of Foresight. We haven't seen pregame effects in quite a while, I think since the Leylines. I think Leylines were the last time we saw anything with a pregame effect. I guess Providence. We saw Providence with the pregame effect from Eldritch Moon. So we don't get to see these pregame effects very often, but seeing it here I think is pretty interesting. I think Sphinx of Foresight's kind of a cool one, definitely an interesting one at the very least. A 4 mana 4/4 flyer that at the beginning of your upkeep scry 1 doesn't really feel like it does quite enough to impact Constructed. We saw Curator of Mysteries didn't really see a ton of play, and this is kind of the card that reminds me the most of Sphinx of Foresight, so maybe we'll end up seeing Sphinx of Foresight seeing a little bit more play than we saw that, and I think there is the potential for just a really sweet mono blue sort of flyers list. Favorable Winds is still legal in Standard, so you can run things like Tempest Djinn, Sphinx of Foresight, Siren Storm Tamer, and Warkite Marauder at the different CMC costs 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then just really curve out really strong. I think has some potential behind it, but maybe that'll be more of just a budget deck in the future, because most of those blue cards that we named aren't really too expensive. Deputed of Detention is the next one. 3 mana for a 1/3 with Detention Sphere tacked onto it. When Deputy of Detention enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls and all other non-land permanents that player controls with the same name as that permanent until Deputy of Detention leaves the battlefield. Again, like I said, this is very reminiscent of the card Detention Sphere, which does see some modern play. With it being on a creature, it is significantly easier to remove a creature than it is to remove an enchantment. However, right now in Standard, there is a very popular tokens deck which goes on, using cards like Saproling Migration, cards like Tristani to generate the tokens, even Legion's Landing creates tokens, those sort of things. And so I think you'll see Deputy of Detention in Standard as a great way of removing those tokens from the board, because then even if you remove the Deputy of Detention afterwards, if you 8-for-1 them with tokens, they're not going to get the tokens back once they deal with the Deputy of Detention. So I think it has a lot of potential there, as well as the fact that it just says non-land permanent. So even if your opponent has, for example, maybe 2 Conclave Tribunals out, something like that, you can remove both of the Conclave Tribunals off of their battlefield, get back the cards that you had underneath the Conclave Tribunals, and that can be a gigantic swing in your favor, especially if you have a way to protect the Deputy of Detention afterwards, like maybe a Wizard's Retort, because that cares about having a Wizard's subtype on a creature, which Deputy of Detention is a Wizard as well, so then you could basically have counterspell backup for the Deputy of Detention. So I kind of like it. Not sure if it's going to see the most play in the world, but I think it's a pretty sweet little card here. Next up, we have everyone's new favorite thing to joke about with on Twitter, which is the fact that we have a creature type Jellyfish Hydra Beast, which is certainly an interesting creature type for Hydroid Krasis here. Jellyfish Hydra Beast is a very, very interesting creature type, like I said, but it has a very interesting ability on it as well. When you cast this card, you gain half X life and draw half X cards. You round down each time. Then it has flying and trample, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So, for example, if we're paying an X of, let's say, 2, for example, this can become a 4-mana 2/2 that draws you a card, gains you a life, and has flying and trample, which is pretty sweet. But as we think about later on in the game, maybe we mix this in with some cards that ramp us, cards like Grow from the Ashes, those sort of things, and even Llanowar Elves is still in Standard to get this guy out sooner. Let's say we're spending 7 mana for this, so it would be something like we'll say 8 mana here. So you have 6 mana going into the X cost, and then you have the green and the blue here. So you have a 6/6 for a 6/6 flying trampler that draws you 3 cards and gains you 3 life when it enters the battlefield, which is crazy. This card is going to be very good for limited. This card's actually just utterly busted in limited, but I think for Standard it has some potential applications to it as well, especially as maybe a win condition in some different green-blue strategies. We've already seen cards in the past that care about +1/+1 counters with this new Simic mechanic, and so I think Hydroid Krasis definitely has the potential to be a fantastic card here in Standard, and if not, it's just going to be the most busted card in limited. So Hydroid Krasis, very, very cool card to have here. Now we're going to take a look at some Planeswalkers here. We have Kaya and Dovin, as well as Judith and Mass Manipulation. We'll cover the non-Planeswalkers first, I guess. So Mass Manipulation is an XX and then 4 blue mana, so you're really not casting this outside of anything that's not just like a mono blue deck. But then it's a sorcery that says gain control of X target creatures and or Planeswalkers. So this is an ability that allows you to steal your opponent's creatures or their Planeswalkers, which stealing Planeswalkers isn't really something we've seen too much of in the past. We've seen it with cards like Dragonlord Silumgar, which allows you to steal your opponent's Planeswalkers, but really aside from that, we haven't really seen a ton of Planeswalker stealing, so Mass Manipulation could be a very unique card in that sense. But at the same time, it's extremely, extremely expensive. If you want to steal one of your opponent's Planeswalkers, it's going to cost you at least 6 mana already. So it does get kind of off there with it being, super expensive. But if they tap out for, a powerful Planeswalker, then you can Mass Manipulation, steal that Planeswalker from them, and then you start generating the value from it. But again, like I said, 6 mana, it's a lot of mana, and so I don't think we're going to see Mass Manipulation seeing too much play, but in limited it does seem like kind of an interesting one. Most of the time you'll just be stealing creatures, but sometimes stealing creatures can be a great way to swing a game in your favor in limited. We'll talk about Judith then, the Scourge Diva. She is 3 mana for a 2/2 legendary creature. Other creatures you control get +1/+0, which is pretty sweet, and then whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith deals 1 damage to any target. So we do finally get to take a look at the first card that really cares about, death of creatures, which gives us the first little insight of maybe there could be a potential aristocrat-style strategy forming in Standard. With Judith, you can use cards like Garnith from Dominaria, or Garnath, whatever that card was called, that returns back the creatures that have died this turn. So you can set up a really big turn where you just like sack all your board with Judith, dealing some damage to them, as well as then using Garnet to return back the creatures that sacrificed themselves this turn. So you have the potential to see some sort of a deck forming there. If not, you just have a regular aristocrat style strategy, which just sort of deals 1 damage here and there, death by 1,000 cuts sort of strategy. But even if it's not death by 1,000 cuts, this could be death by maybe 10 cuts, because it's giving your other creatures +1/+0, which could be really, really strong in Standard if you go sort of wide, which is generally what aristocrat style strategies like to do. So Judith's going to be a must kill if your opponent is going for some sort of an aggressive sort of aristocrat style strategy here in Standard. And then we have Dovin Bond here, Grand Arbiter, 3 mana for 3 loyalty Planeswalker. His +1 until end of turn. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you put a loyalty counter on Dovin. -1, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and you gain 1 life. And then the -7, look at the top 10 cards of your library, put 3 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So the first thing people will point out is that it is a very underwhelming ultimate. Normally you're not going to ultimate a Planeswalker, but when you take a look at a Planeswalker for the first time, the first thing that really catches your eye is that ultimate, and the ultimate here is kind of lackluster. But what we need to point out on Dovin is that if you put Dovin in sort of like a tempo strategy, a blue-white tempo strategy, blue-white aggressive strategy, and use that +1 ability, you can reach that ultimate significantly faster than you would with many other Planeswalkers. So I think the place that you're really looking for Dovin is not so much in the blue-white control decks like we thought we would see Dovin in, but instead we're going to look towards those tempo aggressive strategies, and that's where Dovin's really going to shine, because you'll be able to look at the top 10 cards of your library, then get some more aggressive creatures, which is a fantastic way to recover after maybe something like a board wipe, for example. Like Ritual of Soot is very good right now in the format for these aggressive strategies. If they clear your board with a Ritual of Soot and then you can ultimate the Dovin Bond afterwards, then that can be a great way to recover back from that Ritual of Soot. So I think Dovin really shines in that +1 and then getting to the -7 ability. I think it has some potential to see play in Standard, and I just don't think it's where we all thought Dovin was going to be, which is kind of interesting. We all thought we would see Dovin as kind of how he was in Kaladesh, which is a very control-based Planeswalker, but I think WotC realized that in blue-white, people really just want to play with Teferi. Teferi is the ultimate Planeswalker for a blue-white strategy, and so for this Dovin, or for a blue-white control strategy, I should say, and so what they ended up doing with Dovin was making him more of a tempo aggressive strategy, which I think is a very interesting take on what we were seeing from Dovin here, and I think it has some potential to end up seeing some play in Standard. Maybe I'll post a deck tech here in a couple days that's like a very aggressive blue-white strategy using Dovin as a way to generate some card advantage with his ultimate and acquiring some loyalty counters on him and things like that. And then finally we have Kaya Orzhov Usurper, 3 mana for, again, a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, so very similar to what we're seeing with Dovin. I wonder if Domri Raid will also be 3 mana for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. Wouldn't surprise me, because that's basically what we're seeing here from these two Planeswalkers. So again, like I said, it wouldn't surprise me, since Domri is the other Planeswalker in this set, if he ended up with similar stats compared to Dovin and Kaya. The +1 here on Kaya is exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, and then you gain 2 life if at least 1 creature card was exiled this way. The -1, exile target non-land permanent with converted mana cost of 1 or less. And then finally the -5, Kaya Orzhov Usurper deals damage to target player equal to the number of cards that player owns in exile, and you gain that much life. I don't think Kaya is going to do very well in Standard. She doesn't really do a lot. There isn't really a ton of ways to... there isn't really a ton of like graveyard shenanigans happening in Standard right now, which is really where she shines, messing with your opponent's graveyard. So I don't think Standard's really where we're going to end up seeing her. But as something like a modern sideboard card to deal with some graveyard shenanigans, I think Kaya has some potential. She can go ahead and exile 2 cards. For example, if you're playing against Dredge, that's exiling 2 cards that have the Dredge mechanic, exiling 2 Prized Amalgams, exiling 2 Conflagrates, something along those lines, as well as it has the ability to gain life, which is very crucial against the Dredge decks again. The -1 exiling target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less could be good against things like Death Shadow, where you can exile the Death Shadow. In Standard, though, it does make sense. There are a lot of aggressive creatures, like basically anything from the mono red deck, G2 Lava Runner, Fanatical Firebrand, anything like that. Even in the white aggressive strategies, Sky Marcher, Aspirants, Leonin Vanguard, whatever, I think it's Leonin Vanguard, the 1 mana 1/1 that turns into a 2/2 and gains you a life if you control 3 creatures at the beginning of combat. But I think also what's notable is that it's non-land permanent, so it can hit Legion's Landing as well before the Legion's Landing gets a chance to flip. So there is a little bit of potential there, but again, I think Modern is really where she's going to shine, or at the very least, just as a sideboard card. She doesn't really have mainboard potential, but in terms of sideboard potential, she is there. I think personally, if I'm just going to play some sort of 1 colorless, 1 white, 1 black card in Standard, I would rather just slip a Mortify into my deck rather than Kaya right now. But again, like I said, for sideboard potential, Kaya is there. And I think she has the ability to mess with some graveyard stuff and possibly gain you some life, stay alive a little bit longer. It is a decent little, control finisher, possibly for once you're up against the opponent's control decks. Maybe they don't have a ton of great ways to remove the Planeswalkers. Maybe they're just focusing on counter spells and, Teferi wins and those sort of things. And then you can use the -5 ability to eventually just use it as a win condition against your opponents. Definitely has the potential for something like that too. So again, I think Kaya is really only going to be a sideboard card. I don't see the mainboard potential from Kaya at all. Maybe you guys can see it. But maybe you guys can explain it to me in the comments. I just don't see any mainboard potential for Kaya. But again, as a sideboard card, I do see a little bit of potential. So we'll refresh really quickly, see if any new cards got spoiled, and it doesn't look like they do. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching today's video, where we took a look at some of these new cards spoiled today for Ravnica Allegiance, which again comes out pre-release on the 19th, official release on the 25th. So again, expect a lot of content in between now and those days as we look forward to pre-release and the initial release of Ravnica Allegiance. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it. If you did, a like and a subscription would be immensely appreciated, and I'll see you guys here next time. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, where we talked about the first batch of spoiler cards that we saw here from Ravnica Allegiance. I love to give a shout out and thank you to all of my patrons at the end of all of my videos. So again, huge shout out and thank you to AlbyMTG, Jason, Jeremy, Daniel, Rodrigo, Down Under MTG, and Jayathish Warren for supporting me on the Patreon page. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I love that you guys are willing to support me here on the channel with everything that I do. It truly means a lot to me, and thank you guys so much for watching the video and giving me the support that you guys do.